The cafeteria at Oak Ridge High was a battlefield of unwritten social rules, and on a damp Tuesday morning in late October, Clara Vance was standing right in the crosshairs. She was 17, small for her age, wearing an oversized thrift store denim jacket that seemed to swallow her whole. In her hands, she held a battered sketchbook, her fingers dusted with charcoal. She had transferred to Oak Ridge just 3 days ago, moving into a small, rented house on the edge of town with her father, a man whose silence was heavier than the boxes they had spent the weekend unpacking. Clara kept her head down, her shoulders slightly hunched, making herself as invisible as possible. But at Oak Ridge, looking like you wanted to be invisible was the fastest way to get noticed. Brandon Miller noticed. He was a senior, tall, broad-shouldered, and accustomed to taking up all the space in every room he walked into. Beside him were his usual shadows, Marcus and Tyler, 2 boys who lived off the collateral status of Brandon's casual cruelty. Brandon didn't just bully people, he collected reactions. He liked to see how far someone would bend before they broke, and the quiet new girl with the sad eyes and the oversized jacket looked like she would snap in half. As Clara walked past their table, heading toward an empty bench near the rear exit, Brandon casually stuck out his heavy work boot. Clara didn't trip. Her feet shifted with a subtle, fluid adjustments that went completely unnoticed, but as she stepped around his foot, Brandon reached out, snagged the collar of her worn jacket, and yanked her backward with enough force to tear the fabric near her shoulder. The room went dead silent. Dozens of teenagers paused with forks halfway to their mouths, watching the familiar drama unfold. Brandon leaned in, his grip tight around her collar, pulling Clara so close she could smell the stale mint and coffee on his breath. "Where do you think you're going, Tiny?" he sneered, his voice loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "You didn't pay the toll for walking past this table." Clara didn't scream. She didn't cry. Her hands didn't drop her sketchbook. Instead, her posture shifted in a way that no one in that cafeteria was equipped to understand. Her center of gravity sank just an inch, her breathing slowed to a deep, controlled rhythm, and her eyelids fluttered down for a fraction of a second. If anyone had been looking closely at her eyes, they wouldn't have seen fear. They would have seen an overwhelming, painful restraint. "Let go of my coat, please," Clara said softly. Her voice wasn't shaking. It was flat, perfectly level, carrying a strange, heavy weight that made Brandon's smile flicker for a microsecond before he recovered his arrogant grin. "Or what?" Brandon laughed, turning to glance at Marcus, who snickered on cue. "What are you gonna do? Cry to the principal?" Brandon pulled harder on her collar, lifting her slightly off her heels. What Brandon didn't know, what no one in this sleepy town knew, was that Clara Vance had spent the last 9 years of her life in an isolated training facility 2,000 miles away, practicing a rare, brutal discipline of martial arts under the strict instruction of her grandfather, a former grandmaster who believed that violent force was a burden, not a shield. Clara's body was a weapon tuned to microscopic precision. She could break Brandon's forearm in 3 places before his brain even registered the pain. She could sweep his legs and have him on the floor, but as Brandon yanked her closer, Clara's mind didn't jump to defense. It jumped to a promise she had made 6 months ago beside a hospital bed, holding a hand that was grow cold. A promise that had cost her everything, and the real reason she and her father were hiding in this backwoods town with cheap rents and dark trees. "I said let go," Clara whispered again. Brandon narrowed his eyes, annoyed by her lack of terror. He raised his free hand, forming a loose fist, intending to shove her hard against the nearest row of lockers to break that eerie calm. But before his hand could move an inch forward, Clara's hand moved. It was a blur, so fast that to the kids watching from 3 tables away, it just looked like a jerk of her arm. She caught Brandon's wrist with 2 fingers, touching a specific pressure point right between his radius and bone. Brandon didn't fall, but his entire arm went completely numb. His fingers opened involuntarily, releasing her torn collar. A sharp, icy shock of pain shot up to his shoulder, making him gasp and stumble back 2 paces, clutching his arm with a look of utter bewilderment. He looked at Clara, then at his own hand, which was trembling uncontrollably. "What did you do?" Brandon gasped, his face flushing red with a mix of pain and deep embarrassment as he realized the entire room had just watched him get backed off by a girl who barely hit 5'4". Clara took a slow step back, smoothing down her torn collar with trembling fingers. Her tremble wasn't from fear of Brandon. It was from the terrifying realization of how close she had just come to breaking her oath. "Leave me alone, Brandon," she said quietly, picking up her dropped piece of charcoal from the floor. She turned and walked away, her steps perfectly measured, leaving a stunned silence behind her. By 5th period, the rumor mill had already transformed the cafeteria incident into something bizarre. Some said Brandon had a cramp. Others said Clara had shoved him. But Brandon, humiliated and furious, wasn't about to let it slide. He spent the rest of the day stewing in his anger, his ego bruised far worse than his wrist. He didn't see a girl who possessed incredible skill. He saw a weird transfer kid who got lucky and made him look like a fool. When the final bell rang, Clara didn't take the bus. She preferred to walk the 2 miles back to her home, taking the winding back road that cut through the old lumber yards and dense pine woods. The solitude offered her space to breathe, space to escape the suffocating weight of normal high school life. She carried a dark secret, one that made sitting in a classroom feel like wearing a suit of lead. She was half a mile down the isolated dirt trail when she heard the crunch of gravel behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The heavy, uneven footfalls belonged to Brandon and his 2 friends. They had followed her from the school parking lot, waiting until she was far out of reach of teachers, cameras, or potential witnesses. "Hey! Transfer!" Brandon's voice boomed through the quiet woods. Clara stopped in her tracks. She let out a long, slow exhale through her nose, closing her eyes for a moment. She felt the cool autumn breeze against her face, listening to the rustle of dry leaves. She didn't want this. She had promised herself, promised her father, that she would never raise her hands in anger again. She turned around slowly. Brandon was standing 20 feet away, his jaw set, his friends flanking him like hunting dogs. "You think you're slick, don't you?" Brandon said, taking deliberate steps toward her. "You pulled some weird trick back there. Made me look stupid in front of everybody." "You did that yourself, Brandon," Clara said gently. "Just turn around and go home. Please. There doesn't need to be any trouble." "Oh, there's gonna be trouble," Tyler sneered, holding up a heavy wooden branch he had picked up from the tree line. "Brandon doesn't let anybody make him look bad. You're gonna apologize, right here on your knees, and then you're gonna hand over whatever money you've got in that stupid bag." Clara looked at the branch in Tyler's hand, then at Brandon's aggressive posture. They thought they were the predators in these woods. They had no idea they were standing in front of someone who had spent her childhood fighting grown men in underground dojos, someone whose reflexes were fast enough to catch a strike mid-air. "I don't have any money," Clara said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to surge through her veins. "And I'm not getting on my knees." Brandon lost his patience. "Grab her," he barked at Marcus and Tyler. Marcus lunged forward first, reaching out with both hands to grab Clara's shoulders. Clara didn't even hesitate. Instinct took over. She ducked under Marcus's reaching arms with impossible grace, her body moving like water. As Marcus overextended, she planted her foot behind his ankle and gave a subtle, gentle nudge to his hip. Marcus went flying forward, crashing hard into the dirt path with a heavy thud, gasping as the air was knocked clean out of his lungs. Tyler froze, staring at his friend on the ground, then swung the wooden branch wildly toward Clara's head. Clara didn't flinch. She stepped into the arc of the swing, closing the distance before the branch could gain maximum force. She caught the wood cleanly in the palm of her hand, absorbed the impact with a fluid twist of her wrist, and wrenched it out of Tyler's grip with a sudden twist that left his hands burning. Before he could react, she tapped the end of the stick against his chest, just a firm press, but loaded with enough directed force to knock him backward onto his rear. It had taken less than 4 seconds. 2 grown teenage boys were groaning on the dirt path, completely neutralized without Clara having thrown a single punch. Brandon stood alone, his face pale, his heart hammering against his ribs. The smug anger was gone, replaced by a cold, primal panic. He backed up a step, looking at Clara as if she had suddenly transformed into a ghost. "What are you?" he stammered, his voice cracking. "Are you some kind of freak?" Clara dropped the wooden branch to the ground. It rattled against the stones. She looked at her hands, her knuckles white, her heart breaking inside her chest. The control, the fluidity, the victory, it brought no joy. It only brought back the terrible memory that haunted her every single night. "I told you to go away," Clara said, her voice cracking with raw emotion. "I don't want to hurt anyone. I swore I wouldn't." Brandon, driven by panic and pride, didn't run. He pulled a heavy metal wrench from his back pocket, something he had taken from his auto shop class, and lunged at her in a desperate, wild swing. He wasn't trying to scare her anymore. He was terrified, and terror makes people dangerous. Clara saw the strike coming in slow motion. She could easily dodge it, sidestep, and break his collarbone. She could drop him instantly. But as the metal swung toward her, a memory flashed in her mind. A dark alley 6 months ago, a flashing blade, a moment where she had used her training in anger, and the devastating tragedy that followed. A tragedy that ended a life and shattered her family forever. In that split second of hesitation, weighed down by her guilt, Clara hesitated. She shifted to avoid the lethality of the swing, but she allowed the wrench to strike her shoulder instead of countering. The heavy metal hit her shoulder blade with a sickening crunch. Pain exploded through Clara's left side, sharp and blinding. She gasped, dropping to her knees in the dirt, clutching her collarbone as hot tears welled in her eyes. Brandon stood over her, breathing heavily, the wrench trembling in his hand. He had hit her, but there was no sense of triumph. Looking down at the small girl kneeling in the dirt, holding her shoulder in quiet agony without a single word of complaint, something inside Brandon broke. The realization of what he was doing, using a weapon on a girl in the middle of the woods, hit him like a bucket of ice water. "Brandon, let's go!" Marcus choked out, scrambling to his feet, terrified of what this was turning into. "Man, let's get out of here!" Brandon dropped the wrench into the mud. He backed away, his eyes wide with horror at his own actions, before turning and running down the dirt path with his friends, leaving Clara alone in the darkening woods. Clara remained on her knees for a long time, the cold wind blowing past her, tears streaming down her dusty cheeks. The pain in her shoulder was intense, but it was nothing compared to the ache in her heart. She slowly forced herself up, holding her left arm tight against her chest, and began the long, agonizing walk home. When she finally reached the small, drafty rented house at the end of the lane, the lights were low. Her father, David Vance, was sitting at the kitchen table. In front of him sat an unlit candle and a faded photograph of a smiling woman, Clara's mother. David was a quiet man, a former martial arts instructor who had closed his dojo and burned his uniforms after the accident 6 months ago. He had moved them to this town to give Clara a normal life, away from the whispered accusations and the guilt that had torn their family apart. David looked up as Clara walked in, taking in her disheveled hair, the mud on her jeans, and the awkward, rigid way she was holding her left arm. His eyes darkened instantly. "Clara," David said, his voice low and trembling with immediate concern. "What happened?" "I fell, Dad," Clara lied softly, trying to walk past him toward the stairs. "Just tripped on the trail." David stood up, moving with a quiet, powerful grace that betrayed his years of training. He stepped into her path, gently reaching out to lift her chin. He looked into her eyes, seeing the pain, the dirt, and the fresh rip in her jacket collar. "You didn't fall," David whispered, his heart breaking for his daughter. "Did someone at school do this?" Clara tried to hold it in, but the pain, both physical and emotional, was too much. A tear escaped her eye and tracked through the dust on her cheek. "I didn't hit them back, Dad," she sobbed softly. "I remembered what you said. I remembered what happened to Julian. I held back. I let them hit me because I was afraid of what I would do if I stopped holding back." David pulled his daughter into a careful, tight embrace, minding her injured shoulder. He closed his eyes, resting his chin on her head as his own tears began to fall. The memory of Julian, Clara's older brother, hung heavy in the small kitchen. 6 months ago, Julian, who had also been trained by David, got into a confrontation with street thugs who tried to mug him. Julian had lost his temper, used his lethal martial arts training, and tragically killed one of the attackers. The legal nightmare, the guilt, and Julian's subsequent sentencing to a juvenile detention center had destroyed their family. David had blamed himself for teaching his children how to fight without adequately teaching them how to bear the heavy burden of that power. He had made Clara promise never to fight again, fearing she would meet the same tragic fate. "Oh, Clara," David murmured, holding her tightly. "You don't have to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. You're just a child." The next morning, Clara's shoulder was purple and swollen. David wrapped it tightly with bandages, insisting she stay home from school. But Clara refused. She knew that if she stayed home, Brandon and his friends would think they had broken her. She knew that running away would only make the shadows larger. When Clara walked through the doors of Oak Ridge High that morning, wearing a thick sweater to cover the bandages, the hallway felt quiet. Word of the confrontation in the cafeteria yesterday had spread, though no one knew about the incident in the woods. Brandon was standing by his locker, surrounded by his usual group. But when he saw Clara walk down the hall, his face went pale. He expected her to go straight to the principal's office. He expected the police to show up. He braced himself for the consequences of what he had done with that wrench in the woods. Instead, Clara walked right past him. She didn't look at him with hatred or fear. When her eyes briefly met his, Brandon saw something that chilled him to his core: pity. She looked at him with profound, quiet sympathy, as if she understood the darkness in him better than he did himself. Throughout the day, Brandon couldn't focus. The image of Clara taking the hit, of her holding back her terrifying strength just to keep from hurting him, haunted his mind. He realized that she could have destroyed him in those woods. She had spared him, not out of weakness, but out of an unbelievable, heroic restraint. That afternoon, fate intervened in a way no one could have predicted. A sudden, violent storm rolled over the town, bringing heavy rains and dark, howling winds. The school had called an emergency assembly in the gymnasium due to a power outage caused by fallen trees. Hundreds of students were gathered in the dim light of the gym, sitting on the bleachers, waiting for buses to arrive to take them home safely. Suddenly, a terrifying, metallic groan echoed through the large building. The old wooden roof trusses above the gym, degraded by years of neglect and weighed down by a massive, falling branch from an ancient oak tree outside began to give way. The heavy structure creaked violently under the pressure of the storm winds. A loud crack exploded through the room. A massive portion of the heavy support beam cracked directly above the exit doors where a group of younger students was gathered, trying to peer outside. Panic broke out instantly. Students screamed, rushing toward the opposite exits, pushing and shoving in a chaotic stampede. Teachers shouted for calm, but their voices were lost in the roar of the storm and the terrifying sounds of splintering wood. Brandon, who was standing near the center of the gym, watched in horror as a heavy section of the ceiling truss began to collapse, swinging down like a pendulum directly toward a terrified freshman girl who had tripped and fallen on the polished floor, paralyzed by fear. Brandon froze, terrified, unable to move his legs. Then, a shadow moved. Clara moved with a speed that defied human logic. Ignoring the agony in her bandaged shoulder, she surged through the panicking crowd like a lightning bolt. In a fraction of a second, she reached the fallen girl, scooped her up with one arm, and hurled her safely out of the collapse zone into the arms of a nearby teacher. But there was no time for Clara to clear the area herself. The massive, water-logged wooden beam, weighing hundreds of pounds, came crashing down directly toward her head. What happened next would be talked about at Oak Ridge High for decades. Clara didn't scream. She rooted her feet into the wooden floor, dropped into a deep, perfect stance, and extended both hands upward. With an explosion of pure force, sound, and willpower, Clara caught the falling support beam with her bare hands. The sheer impact rattled through her bones, sending a shockwave that cracked the floorboards beneath her feet. Her mouth opened in a silent scream of agony as the immense weight pressed down on her already injured shoulder. But she didn't collapse. She held it. She stood there, a tiny 17-year-old girl, holding up a crushing section of the roof with her raw strength, technique, and indomitable spirit. "Run!" Clara roared, her voice echoing through the massive gymnasium like thunder. "Get out!" The gym went dead quiet except for the howling wind. Everyone, students, teachers, the principal, turned to look in absolute, stunned disbelief. Brandon stared, his jaw dropped, his eyes wide as teacups. He saw the girl he had bullied, the girl he had hit with a wrench, standing like a mythological titan, holding back death itself to save people who had offered her nothing but cruelty. Understanding struck Brandon like a bolt of lightning. The guilt, the shame, and the sudden realization of what real strength meant shattered his arrogant facade instantly. "Help her!" Brandon screamed at the top of his lungs, breaking the spell over the crowd. Brandon didn't run for the exit. He charged forward, sprinting across the gym floor toward the collapsing zone. Marcus and Tyler, moved by Brandon's sudden desperation, followed right behind him. Brandon slid beside Clara, grabbing the heavy wooden beam with his broad shoulders, pushing up with every ounce of strength in his body. "I've got it! I've got you!" Brandon yelled, tears streaming down his face, mixing with sweat. Marcus and Tyler joined, along with two brave teachers who rushed in to help. Together, leveraging their combined weight, they managed to push the beam just enough for Clara to slide out from underneath it. The second she was free, the group backed away as the rest of the section crashed violently onto the empty floor, sending dust and debris exploding into the air. Clara collapsed into the dust, her breathing ragged, her body completely exhausted. Her bandaged shoulder was bleeding slightly, but she was alive. Brandon dropped to his knees beside her in the dirt and debris. He didn't look like a tough guy anymore. He looked like a boy who had finally seen the truth. Tears were falling freely down his face as he looked down at Clara. "Why?" Brandon choked out, his voice breaking completely. "Why did you stay? Why did you save us after what I did to you?" Clara slowly looked up at him, her dark eyes clear, quiet, and beautiful despite the dust on her face. She reached out with a trembling, dust-covered hand and gently touched his forearm, the same arm she had rendered numb just 2 days ago. "Because real strength isn't about hurting people, Brandon," Clara whispered softly, her voice carrying across the quieted gym. "Real strength is having the power to destroy someone and choosing to protect them instead." Brandon lowered his head, sobbing openly. In the weeks that followed, the story of Oak Ridge High changed forever. The truth about Clara's incredible martial arts background eventually came out, not as a threat, but as an inspiration. Her father, seeing his daughter use her gift not for vengeance or anger, but to save lives, finally let go of his own dark guilt. He reopened his training facility, teaching the youth of the town not just how to fight, but how to master themselves. Brandon never bullied anyone again. He became the first student to sign up for David Vance's classes, learning humility, discipline, and respect beside the very girl he had once tried to break. He wore his scars not as badges of honor, but as reminders of the grace he had been shown when he deserved it least. True power isn't measured by how many people you can bring to their knees. It is measured by how many people you are willing to lift up when they fall.